Okay then, so hello everybody. If I resume the conversation, I imagine that will bring the spectators back in who seem to have disappeared. So welcome for this second roundtable on new narratives with a remote participant, Primavera De Filippi, who is a specialist in digital technologies and blockchain at the CNRS, who also teaches at Harvard, and who is very familiar with these questions of digital governance and commons, who we will be discussing with later. On my right, Chloe Riedel, who is a senior civil servant and who is familiar with European questions for having worked on these subjects and also for having written a lot about this. And also Shaheen Valley, and apparently if you have a white Volkswagen Golf which is badly parked, you need to remove it. So Shaheen Valley is with me, who is an economist, who advisor to the President of the European Council of Europe, and works in a German think tank, VDGAP. I won't try to say that in German. It's a think tank that is specialized in international relations and dealing with international questions, so different views of this crisis of the European model and its possible renaissance. I would have liked to begin with a question to Shaheen Valley. Shaheen, we talk a lot today about capitalism, American US capitalism, which is very clearly identified with the GAFA, the giga firms, which have this huge market, economic and political power today. We're talking increasingly about Chinese-style production methods, like Robert Boyer mentioned, this economic system based on a mix between the power of the Communist Party and also free initiative, which is based on close surveillance and exploitation of data. But when we talk about European capitalism, sort of like a question mark there. We don't really know what it is. A lot of company leaders and trade unionists complain that we're influencing the respective influences of the Chinese and American models. Would you agree? I would say it is quite fair to say that there's no such thing as a real European capitalism if you're talking about it in the way you talk about Chinese or American capitalism. There isn't a structure there producing coherent or collinear economic effects. So that's quite true, but that's because there are still national So we'll hope that whoever it is removes their car. So there we see European capitalism at work, because there are still national capitalisms which remain relatively well established. There's this notion of national champions, which is perceived as very attractive in France, and which, in my opinion, is one of the reasons for the absence of a European capitalism, the fact that many member states are still trying to organize an economic fabric for the primary purpose of preserving or increasing their national economic interests. So I would say the weakness or absence of European models is also linked with the relative strength of the national models. There is a form of French capitalism, there is a form of German capitalism, and apart from a few exceptions, there aren't many transnational forms of capitalism, except perhaps for Airbus. So relatively few examples like this. There have been several missed opportunities to create that space. We can talk about that perhaps when we talk about the question of production of standards, the GSM standard, which was central to mobile telephones, the European standard, and there were European telecommunications giants like Ericsson and Nokia who were swept aside because Europe didn't manage to establish that standard as an asset of its capitalism. and there have been missed opportunities for mergers between France and Deutsche Telekom, which could have produced digital or telecommunications giants for reasons mainly due to perceptions of diverging economic interests between the member states, which meant this didn't work out. You're talking at the same time about standards, about telecoms operators who have more or less disappeared in the worldwide competition. If I turn now to Primavera de Philippi, a specialist in new technologies and blockchain, this is a very good case study, I would say, to reflect on the European model. Does the lack of specifically European governance of these technologies, is it due to the absence of a European equivalent of the GAFAM? An absence of these big companies with the market power, or is it a broader, more structural issue of a lack of reflection on normative standards of what European standards should be? I think I think that in terms of the reflection, the thinking that's going on, I think there's probably more thinking going on in Europe than in the US, at least, regarding how this infrastructure should be governed. The European Commission is very closely involved in these questions. For me, the problem is more one of the way in which we try to regulate this transnational network, which is internet, via the operators, the intermediaries, which means we regulate those operators in order to then regulate the uses made of their platforms. And therefore, necessarily, if we don't have the control over those operators, it becomes much more difficult. So although there are several things which have been done at European level, the problem, obviously, is that these operators have reached a scale which escapes even the control of the US government. We have the GAFAM, which have started inventing their own rules. We've seen that with Facebook, etc. So I think there is the question of the reflecting on the sort of regulations that we want to implement, and then the question of how we can enforce those regulations. And obviously that involves the operators, and having operators at a European level would enable us to enforce the rules much more easily, and having always to have the rules enforced by existing operators who are outside European jurisdiction is much more complicated. So I think the concern is not so much one of the thinking. European is taking part also in the work being done on questions at the international forums, but we are missing that central focus, as nearly all the internet traffic goes via either the US and the GAFAM or through the Chinese ecosystem. And in Europe, we don't have that, which means that we cannot directly apply or experiment with regulations on our own operators. Would you like to say, if I could just add something regarding the norms, the standards, and the relationship the Europeans have with standard production? We have an ambiguous relationship. At the same time, we are aware of the fact that normative powers in Europe are important in defining a European identity and our capacity for economic projection. And at the same time, we don't quite accept the idea of using our normative power to impose our power, to use it as an instrument with extraterritorial reach, and to accept the tensions that go with the idea of implementing our normative power. Two recent examples are quite evocative in this respect. There was the Volkswagen scandal regarding the emissions of CO2 of vehicles, Europe was very proud to present itself as a worldwide model in ecological transition and clean vehicles, and in reality was incapable of detecting the misleading mechanisms being used by European car makers. And in the end, it took the US regulator, in fact, to step in and have European companies convicted for breaches of rules the Europeans themselves had decided on. A second example to what Natalie said about European leadership in climate issues, which could be a dimension of our identity, on the question of green finance, etc. Once again, the Europeans had 5 years during the Trump period when those subjects were entirely deserted, left to one side, neglected by the US administration, on which only Europe is the only normative power to establish norms. And when you see the conclusions of Saturday's G7 meeting, we see that, in fact, all the European normative effort has been set aside in favour of an agreement which seems to me inferior and presented by the UK, which proposes greater transparency, but really leaves it very much up to the market. So I think that Europeans have this ambiguous relationship with the standards, the norms, which we need to reflect on. I agree with what was said about the fact that we think a lot about the norms, but we don't perhaps push it through to the logical conclusion of the process. When you have those norms, sometimes you have to impose them on other people, and in that case you have to accept that enforcement of the standard is almost as important as production of the norm. Before we come back to Primavera, would you agree with this, that the Europeans are good at producing these norms or standards, but have more difficulty enforcing them or backing them up by the self-definition? Does that also apply in new technologies in particular? Yes. It's more difficult. I don't know if it's a lack of determination. The will is there to enforce the standards. In digital technologies, we have the GPDR, which is being enforced. So there is a desire, I think, to apply the standards, having said that the difficulty is that these are often norms or standards which remain very much protectionist in their inspiration. So if we want to prevent actors from breaching the rights of our citizens rather than seeking those norms in the standards and promoting European norms and trying to expand them beyond the scope of Europe, I think there is the traditional legal standard which is protective. And I think that in digital technologies, the European Commission is striving to enforce its rules. And then there is the creation of norms or standards, technical standards. And there, obviously, Europe does have a big role to play, which isn't being exploited at the moment, at least not to the full. So, Chloe, I turn to you. Would you agree with this feeling that Europe has difficulty defining its own model in opposition to an American model under which it has often been influenced by, and a rising Chinese model? And what could, to bring us on to the second part of our conversation, what could the components be for such a political or economic model? I agree entirely with the analysis that Europe is not managing to adopt and to project its own model because it didn't have to do so for many years, because the model of capitalism is adopted after the Second World War, which was derived from Anglo-Saxon capitalism, came from the world order after the Second World War, inherited from the United States and also from a certain European model. So it didn't have to impose its model and think about it, because ultimately it was a model which an expanding global model. But now that Europe is setting back into a more defensive position, because on its markets there are predatory logics which are no longer just in the eastern or poorer countries, but also in the countries in Germany, which is seeing predatory practices by Chinese companies. There was Cooper, which was bought out by a Chinese firm, which shocked public opinion in Germany. So the whole of the European market is facing this predatory aggression, faced with giants asserting their powers and who aren't always very friendly towards Europe. Europe, it is true, therefore has to impose its own model and defend it, promote it, preserve it. But it has difficulty defining it, quite simply because it can't come to an agreement on a model to replace the current absence or vacuum of model. What we see in the European treaties is a sort of hybrid between the German style and Anglo-Saxon capitalism, in which France is relatively absent. If we think about the model of French capitalism based on a lot of state intervention in the economy, which with monopolies in public services, this model has been assaulted by the European treaties. So it's difficult to come to an agreement on what a European model, capitalist model, actually means, whereas China does this quite simply. They call it characteristic Chinese socialism, with a very clear compromise with a strong state, which confuses the state, merges the state and the party, with control over the economy, which guarantees people prosperity, and in return there is very little individual freedom, or none at all. So that is the Chinese compromise. The American compromise is going to be a free market, but with intervention by the state in the economy when they have to defend US companies, with state funding for the big American companies, extraterritorial reach of the US laws, and no welfare protection. That's the US model. What might the European model be? I think that when you have tried for quite a number of years now to define what a European model might be, we've often talked about identity with the question of what does it mean to be European. These were very rich debates around the constitutional treaty in 2004 when we were talking about the Christian origins of Europe. You have George Steiner in 2005, who published a book defining ways to identify European strategies, but in a very abstract way, nothing that could drive a political project, which was talking about our awareness of our own contingency, so criteria which could in no way make it possible to fertilize a European political project. So I think we have to reach back to our history. In the last panel, I don't know who it was, but said Europe isn't 70 years old. It's in fact much older, and we have to look at the specific value systems of Europeans and Europe. And when we ask ourselves that question in a historic perspective, we come up with the question of what distinguishes us from the rest of the world. Political liberalism. It doesn't distinguish us from the US, but it does from the Arab countries and China. The welfare state, the social state, the UK, which shares a lot of things with the US, much more than any European country, is profoundly European because of its social welfare model. And it's absurd that Brexit should have been focused on the funding of the NHS, because the welfare state is a European invention, and the European social states were constructed roughly at the same time and in a dialogue with each other. So we have to rehabilitate this idea that Europe is a social market economy, and from that political liberalism and the importance of the welfare social state, that leads to a certain political ecology, which is one of the drivers of European power for the 21st century, because that political ecology, this whole movement of thought, was born in Europe, is strong in Europe. It's in Europe that we have the most climate organizations, climate NGOs. It's in Europe that Greta Thunberg was born, who's now inspiring the whole world. So we have a lot of things to say in Europe about ecology, and I think that's also an important component of this. So with ecology, political liberalism and the welfare state, and we can refound our treaties around that. Shaheen, you said earlier that there was no such thing as European capitalism because there's French capitalism, German-style nationalism, Scandinavian nationalism. If we look to the future, what might be the salient characteristics of any such European capitalism, if it should be called capitalism? Is it not a social market economy or a mixed economy? So how would you define this new European capitalism? And then I'll ask Primavera the same question, but regarding the issues of governance. It's not easy because we are experiencing a moment of very profound intellectual and political renewal. What Chloe said about ultimately the transatlantic consensus on the economic model is quite true. That transatlantic consensus has its roots in the Bretton Woods organizations. In Europe, we lived with the idea that we didn't have to think too much about the economic model because it was there for us. There was an interesting paper after the 2008 crisis. You're familiar with the idea of the Washington consensus, and I'm going to caricature it a bit. The neoliberal consensus imposed and spread by the Bretton Woods institutions, and notably the IMF and the World Bank. And a paper after 2008 said it's a crisis of neoliberalism, and precisely when the US is criticizing themselves of the impact of neoliberalism on American policy and economics, the Europeans aren't. And there was a paper by a researcher at the LSE saying that Brussels is saving the Washington consensus. So what I observe for the moment is there is a lot more movement, a lot more going on intellectually in the US to redefine a new US capitalism. The current debates in the US around corporate taxation, around the idea of a tax on assets and on wealth. There isn't yet a constructed political project for this or a legislative framework, but a very strong intellectual debate. However, in Europe, I have the impression that that debate hasn't really taken place, or at the moment isn't yet taking place, and that we're still clinging to the economic framework that shaped Europe and in which our treaties are based, with relatively little reflecting on a new taxation of assets to try to act on inequalities and poverty, as Nathalie Nougaret said earlier. So I think that when there should be debate both at national and transnational levels, that's not taking place. So that is my regret. And what I would tend to say formally is that Chloe is perhaps right when she says that for these debates to take place, we need to have a debate about our constitution, our treaties. Ultimately, a lot of this intellectual consensus is based on our legal political framework, and in order to dare to have these debates, we need to have a constitutional debate, and that constitutional debate we had after 2005, which aborted for the reasons we know. But I continue to think that we need to have a new debate of this kind, and we can't make major progress on the definition of a European model if we don't have that profound discussion about a new treaty or a new framework.
So, Primavera, you work a lot on the questions of governance and institutions. Is Europe the place to develop the new model of governance that would be inspired by new technologies or not? And if yes, which ones? I'll start with the first one. The second's more complicated. I think that this comes back to the economic approach. In China, we're seeing a very interventionist approach on the economy and an authoritarian government that applies very strict rules. And compared with the United States, where they have a more laissez-faire attitude and they'll only intervene to make sure that the market can operate properly. The state will intervene less and leaves more room for private intervention. And I think Europe, it's in a more complicated situation. It's interesting to see how these two approaches are appreciated in both countries, even though they're pointing fingers at each other. The Chinese prefer a system with a government that intervenes and that will ensure the prosperity of the country and not leave the citizens dying in the streets, whilst the Americans would prefer to have a system that's completely managed by the market rather than having direct state intervention, even if the market doesn't necessarily protect everyone with education, even with education and social security. So they point fingers at each other and they're happy with their systems, and Europe's in the middle. They point their fingers in both directions, and so we're obliged to find an intermediate mechanism. We're seeing a market economy that works well, with sufficient intervention to ensure our social security. And I think that the advantage of the European system is that it's still a fragmented one with a strong national identities that can be interconnected. And for me, the European model identifies not how we can strengthen Europe in a federal manner, but rather how we can decentralize and how Europe can be a platform that will integrate and recognize the existing interdependencies at an economic and social and political level. If there's innovation in governance that could come from Europe and inspire other countries in the world, it would be that. How we can create a government that supports and that helps existing actors to interconnect, to support each other, and to emancipate themselves, if possible, without imposing too many restrictions or strong interventions, to not limit the autonomy of member countries, but that will not leave everything up to the markets, that will take care of some and not others. So I don't think it's a compromise. It's not where we place ourselves between laissez-faire and interventionists. It's how we get out of that compromise, and how, with this vision of interdependence, can we build a system that is much more resilient, much stronger, and that will really help the autonomy of the countries rather than suffocate them. Is that it's not possible in the current European institutional framework today. We have the worst of both systems. We have the feeling that we have a huge bureaucracy in Brussels that suffocates us, and there's a real lack of political power because the last word always comes to the nation states. So I'm not asking you to invent a constitution here right now, but how can we operationalize what you're saying, this idea of this Europe as a decentralized platform that can use its fragmentation to become a strength? There's the political question that's quite complicated. That's the big problem today, is that it's difficult to experiment because we don't know if the member states will like our proposed experiment. Then there's my own personal bias. Can technological innovations create political innovations? And I think that there are things that can be done to take advantage of these new technologies and to not just use them like the American model with surveillance or the Chinese model with their model. So how can we use the new technologies at the service of our institutions? And I'm obliged to talk about it. It's my obsession. Can we create infrastructure that will allow us to share information, to coordinate certain activities between the member states without having to create an authority, a supranational organization that will integrate and recover some powers to allow coordination? So for me, the challenge today is to try to understand how the coordination could be set up, or this integration be set up without having to strengthen the political structure, but rather to show that there are obvious benefits in cooperation between the member states and in the interconnection and interdependency. The fact that we're participating in shared infrastructure will not reduce their political power. They will benefit from the interconnection. So that's a very interesting idea. It would be to reinforce Europe by playing on its decentralization through cooperation and interdependence infrastructure between the member states. So we'd also be in a system where the European Commission wouldn't exist anymore, and everything would play out in a decentralized way between the member states. Shahin, what do you think about that? I find it fascinating intellectually, but I don't see how it could become operational. And perhaps I'm a little bit old in my thinking, or maybe just too old. There are things that the state does that cannot be involved in this cooperation on a platform. The strength of law has to be imposed, and for this to happen, there has to be a legal framework that does not have a horizontal structure. It has a vertical structure, and we talked about that a bit earlier. Let's take the example of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which today, since we don't have a real constitution, the chapter in a constitution that would describe our fundamental rights, and this is defended by the European courts to protect the privacy of European citizens. There was a recent case in Europe because the Council of State decided that the French intelligence services could continue to collect data massively, and the European Court of Justice said that this was illegal, and the actions of the French intelligence organization was against the European Charter of Fundamental Rights. So what you described earlier, to have relationships between member states of cooperation, can no longer come into play. There's a certain vertical nature that has to be imposed. There's a legal structure, a hierarchy that must be in place, and I don't see how we can get away from that in the economy. I see that there are lots of cases in which the system of horizontal platforms can work. In the system that I imagine when I think of power in France, I think our our government is too central and too vertical, and I'd be in favor of what was just described, to have a more horizontal and regional system. But I think that some prerogatives can only be organized by a state and a legal framework and a political structure that has a certain central nature. And I don't know how we can get away from that. And even if it sounds a bit stodgy, I can't imagine a better system than a federal system to organize this, because this is the system that makes it possible to organize the central aspects of the state and the strength of the state for their actions, and makes it possible to decentralize some power for things that can be decentralized. Primavera?
Je n'essaye pas d'argumenter qu'il faut éliminer toute institution centralisée.
I'm not saying we're trying to get rid of all centralized institutions. I'm to say that we should try to identify the elements that we want to share and that we want to delegate. There's the notion of subsidiarity in law, where we have a centralized body that will delegate information to smaller entities that are more able to make decisions. That's the idea behind a federation. And then there's the idea of subsidiarity. It's the opposite. So there are entities, small entities, that are there to coordinate for better governance between us. And we don't have enough ability ourselves to manage that. So we need to send information up for that. And theoretically, we'll end up at the same point, because we'll be bottom up and top down. We'll be in the smallest entity that will be able to make decisions by integrating the externalities. But in practice, if we start from the top, we'll stay too high, and if we start from the bottom, we'll stay too low. So today, in our vision of subsidiarity, are we really at the right place, or are there elements? And I'm not trying to eliminate the upper structure, but perhaps there are elements that we could bring lower down. There was a time where we couldn't, because we didn't have the technological infrastructure necessary. Now we have new tools, so couldn't we make it possible to delegate things further down? So to connect to the level that we would have if we started from the bottom and we moved up. So if we start from the bottom, we might not have coordination that is sufficient. We might not have the right governance, because there'll be a desire to not bring power up to higher levels. So the two systems will never find the most efficient model. My proposal here is, if we want Europe to be an inspiring model for the rest of the world, we're living in an interconnected and interdependent world. So do we want to have this vision of a global government that will coordinate everything, that will be very effective and optimized, but with the problems of governance that would go with that excessive centralization? Or do we want to have a fragmented system, disconnected system, where we can create borders because we want to stay independent, and that's also negative? And so how do we maximize the integration? How do we integrate the system that's the most interconnected as possible, that recognizes the benefits of the interdependence which is necessary? But we have to manage this interdependence properly. If it becomes a form of dependence, it won't be accepted. While if we manage to create a model that allows countries to maintain their autonomy and yet participate in a larger system, in that case, we could have a model that would inspire questions of global governance. So Chloe, on the question of model between Europe of nations, federal Europe, and a more decentralized Europe, what's your opinion? I think we need to go beyond this debate. that seems from last century, with on one side the federalists and the other side intergovernmentalists. We've seen that Europe can be something else, more than just a cooperation between nation states and a federal model that they've never been able to develop. So I think we need to think of Europe in its profound originality, which is a political group that gets nations to cooperate. I understand the attraction of a federal model, and there are binational federal states, Belgium, Canada, and other federal models across the world. And I see why that's attractive to have to enforce a common discipline. But a federal model always involves a vertical nature in the fact that the federal constitution must be higher than the constitutions of the states that are federated. And in Europe, that wouldn't be acceptable. And we see this with the Karlsruhe Court jurisprudence. We're not prepared to accept that national constitutions, even if in case law this is the case, they want national constitutions to be sovereign in the end. So we have to invent a model that is for Europe, that shows our real originality, and it has to be part of the new European narrative, the new Europe that we need to invent. When we go back to the origins of European construction, just after the Second World War, we had an idea of Europe based on Jean Monnet's that's based on three things. Firstly, a narrative, a raison d'être. At the time, it was peace, prosperity. It was also based on a prospect, a federal European Union, and a method of progressive integration of administrations and markets. This new idea of Europe is not there. We have peace between France and Germany, but we don't have prosperity. The prospect of a federation is off the table, and the method of progressive integration has disappeared because there's no reason to do it the way things are currently. And if we go back to these three pillars, we need to propose a raison d'être, a reason for existing, which could be the preservation of a European model based on three components. Secondly, an outlook, a prospect for the future, a political Europe with a new organization, a new market. And thirdly, a method. And that would lead us to think about what could bring us to tip into this new idea of Europe, this new era in Europe of the 21st century. And I think that this tipping point, that was the creation of the European Community of Steel and Coal in the 50s, we need to think of the same type of tipping agent, because the CECA had been the symbol of the European idea. We are taking war resources to make peace. We create a federal organization because the CECA worked in a federal way, and it symbolized progressive integration. So I think we need to think about what strong political initiative we can take that would tip us into this, that would symbolize this new European idea that we're aspiring to. So what type of initiative could this require? I don't have an answer to that. But in what Chloé's just said, where I agree with Chloé, is that we're not a federation today, and wanting to impose a federal model today would mean wanting to impose a model for which our institutions are not prepared. Nevertheless, the federal model had and continues to have a virtue, which is to define a horizon, an aspiration, and a lot of European projects. For me, the federal model has to stay a goal, because without that heading, we won't be able to hold the architecture of the European construction. We have a dysfunctional democracy in Europe. We have a dysfunctional market in Europe. We have a legal framework that is dysfunctional in Europe for the reasons that Chloe talked about earlier, this constant dialogue between constitutional judges to produce supranational constitutional standards. And I think for me, the only way of accepting this series of dysfunctions is to say that it's a step along this journey. If we say that this is the stationary position, we can't continue the construction. We can say to Europeans, we have a democracy that you're attached to, but yet doesn't work well, and it won't work any better in future. And I don't think any of us could say that. That's why I hold on to this idea, the ideal of a federation, of a legal and political structure organized in a federal framework with the supranational constitution, because I think it's the only way that we're going to achieve this. Even if it takes a century, it's the only way to say to Europeans what we're living through right now, which is not ideal, is worth it, because we're trying to reach our ideal. If we give that up and we don't propose anything else, I don't have anything better to propose. And in what I've heard today, I haven't heard any intellectually satisfying solutions that I could put into operational terms. If we say that to Europeans, we're going to produce a feeling of rejection. We have no horizon and no project for today to sell. So the big danger of the criticism which I hear, and it's not unfounded, about federalism, but in my opinion, the critique doesn't propose an alternative, or else we have to assume and say, if we're not moving towards a federal Europe, let's accept everyone take our toys and go home. The integrated market that we built can only function with the federal Europe. Let's accept to say that the single currency that we've built can only work with the infrastructure of a state, the legal and political structure that goes with it. And in that case, let's draw our conclusions. People who say, I've had this debate with Chloe often, who say we'll never have a federal Europe, they have to, in that case, say, well, we shouldn't have the single market that we have today or the single currency we have today, because those are elements of a federation. The fact that we have this shared currency is, and to print money is the privilege of the state. So Primavera, what do you think? China has come up with and he is saying we have the model of the nation states and the federal model. And both depend on the vertical nature, because a federal structure would be the same construction as a national structure, but at a bigger level. So what do you think? Do you think that this is something that can be overcome? And if we can overcome it, how can we get Europeans to move towards something else? What can you propose? How can it become operational? And what about the cultural dimension? What can we head towards? I don't know if I have a complete answer. For me, I think we could have a very well-built federal system that would work better than our current system, and we could create a federal system that would be worse than our current system. For me, the question is, what doesn't work today? And are there contingencies and externalities that we need to manage that are independent of the structure of Europe, of whether we have a centralized federal government or not? So for me, that's not the question. I think that the current political form of Europe is quite interesting in the fact that it's an intermediate structure. I'm not sure that federalism is the only solution. I'm not saying that it would be a bad solution, but I don't know if focusing only on this political structure will really solve the problems that Europe is encountering today? Are they problems of such different types that if we could address them correctly, we could maintain the current structure and have a single market that works just as well? So I have the feeling, I'm not criticizing, let's try, it's not working today, so if we do something federal, it might work better. But is that just an excuse to not delve more deeply into the real problems? What are the real problems? Why isn't it working? There are lots of reasons. It's not just the current political format of Europe. Let's try to solve these problems first. And if it turns out that a good way of solving the problem is to adopt a federal structure, let's design this federal structure in a way that it will solve the problems. But just saying that we're going to adopt a federal model will solve all the problems, I don't think that's the solution. It could be quite risky, and it could blind us to underlying problems that we won't have solved. So the problem that you're talking about, I put in this way. We need Europe to protect us from the rest of the world, except that within Europe, we want to stay free and maintain our democracies that are at a national scale. So we have a problem that might seem impossible to solve. So we want Europe to serve us from the outside, and we want to stay as free as possible inside. It's possible to achieve that, but I'm not sure if it's agreeing to a constitution with the smallest common denominator, a federal constitution, that will allow us to solve this problem. I'm convinced that it's not the case. And when you say, Shaim, that federation gives a prospect for the future, it's true. But I think that it's mostly administrative and organizational. A federal union, for what political program? Why do it? So we could replace this idea that was a mobilizing idea with another idea for the future, Europe that preserves the pillars of the organizational structure of European countries and our European way of living. I've thought of a system with a double lock where we have a market that we would maintain as European, because that's our strength in globalization. We maintain that European level for the markets that will allow us to export our standards to the rest of the world and protect our standards. So we agree on minimum European standards, which is already true for a certain number of cases. But within the market, we don't prevent those who want to adapt more ambitious standards for the environment and for the social protection. We should not prevent them. Most of these things are defined by the market today, so we have to allow states that want to go further on the social or environmental level to do so without being penalized by the market. If they want to build their own standards, that's the life of democracy. So there has to be reciprocity or borders within Europe with a system of the double locks that will allow us to keep our collective power with respect to the outside world, but also our freedom within the group. So we're almost at the end of this very interesting discussion. I want to ask each of you, in 3 words, what would be the European model for the 21st century as you recognize it? Primavera?
In 3 words? Impossible. I'm cheating. It's a model. Decentralized, institutional, interconnected model. Right, that gives us a subject for a future discussion. And we don't know what institutional means here, so that will be interesting. Although she has already explained what she means by institutional, but that will be a subject for a future. And Shane, your 3 words? For me, it would be a model that is green, fair, within the meaning of social justice and democratic. That should be the three foundations. I would agree with Shaheen. So just to add something, I will say that it must be a model that is protective, fundamentally European and democratic. In that case, thank you to all three of you for taking part in this roundtable. We have a question. You can ask your question if you want, but he needs a microphone. So thank you. It really was most interesting. I really appreciated in the previous debate what Mrs. Nougaret said, and this gives us an idea of the big narratives in which I don't believe personally. But having said that, I'm astonished that you didn't talk, given the history of Europe, which is a history which, in my opinion, is fundamentally motivated by the world, by openness to the world, by what we call cosmopolitanism in the 18th century. I don't understand that you don't take this as a parameter, a fundamental parameter of Europe. China holds its place by the fact that it has a very self-centered vision. China, by its cultural origins, considers that it is the center of the world, and that the rest of the world is something which just forms concentric circles and might become a part of it. But it's not cosmopolitan. Cosmopolitanism is accepting the world and hoping that the fragmentation of the world may give rise to dialogue. The United States is something else again. So the European model is cosmopolitan, so why not include that in your projects? Europe can't be made if it doesn't accept the fact that it is acting for the world, for itself. That's all very well to protect Europeans. That, in my opinion, is much too conservative. The Europeans have always, in their history, even if they are afraid of it, always looked outwards, projected outwards internationally, worldwide. Thank you. Would anything like to answer? Yeah. You are right. It's a fascinating issue we didn't talk about, which I think was more for the subject of the first panel discussion rather than this one. I have several explanations which might not be right, but I think we have a problem with our relationship with the rest of the world, because the key moments in the relations between Europe and the rest of the world have been violent. The Crusades, imperialism, slavery, colonization. And you are right in saying that we have made these moments which do embody ideas other than violence, seizing the property and the bodies of people. We have also made these moments of protection of values, but we do have difficulty dissociating this, the dark side, from the lighter side of our relationship with the rest of the world. And that, for me, is one of the problems, but where I think you're right, is that it's an essential component of defining a calm, serene European identity. All the malaise in European identity is due to the fact that we are incapable of digesting this complex history we have with the rest of the world, and therefore producing a European identity which is at peace with the rest of the world and with the heirs of the relationships we had previously with the rest of the world. And I think that big difficulty is one of the fundamental issues in this malaise of identity in Europe. As long as we think that European identity is just our Christian roots, I think we're going to have a problem. As long as we don't accept to say out loud that European identity has a huge international contribution. Also, a huge Jewish contribution. Today, we act as if the only contribution of the Jewish identity to European identity was the Shoah, especially in Eastern Europe. As we often discuss with Nathalie, with this sort of fantasy they have of their pure white Christian history, when in fact they're the birthplace of this Yiddish and Jewish culture, even though they have exterminated it. Thank you, in any case, for coming and for following us online as well in large numbers, and we'll see you again very soon to continue working on the construction of new narratives, notably European narratives. Thank you.